latest research on donor-advised funds. Hi, I'm Bill Stanczykiewicz. This is the first day from the Fundraising School, and I'm delighted to welcome back two of my cherished colleagues, Dr. Dan Heist, professor at Brigham Young University and leader of the Donor Research Collaborative, as well as Dr. Jen Shaker. She sits in the Campbell Chair of Fundraising Leadership at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, home to the Fundraising School, where Jen's research informs our curriculum. She also introduces us to other research that we can put into our courses. And so, Dan and Jen, I'm so delighted to have you back with us. And a new study is coming out. It was released recently at AFP ICON in Seattle. And Jen, why this research and why now?
Well, I don't know about you, Bill, but I can't help but to have noticed the proliferation of DAFs over the last several decades, really. I remember first seeing them when I was a fundraiser more than 20 years ago and receiving gifts from them. And what a different landscape we have now. So these days, there are almost 2 million DAF accounts, $250 billion held in DAFs. In 2023, about 60 billion was contributed into DAFs and about 55 billion came out of DAFs to nonprofits. And so they have just really changed the landscape. I think I also noticed when I've been teaching for the fundraising school that whenever DAFs come up, I might as well throw the agenda out the window because we're going to talk about DAFs for a long time. So there's just a lot of interest, a lot of curiosity, a lot of uncertainty in the fundraising community when it comes to DAFs, and just wanted to do something to help. And, as part of my role as the Campbell Chair, to help do research and help contribute practical knowledge to the field. And so it just made a lot of sense. And I was so excited when Dan invited me to work with him on this project.
And Dan, along with Danielle Vance McMullen, co-creator of the Donor Advised Fund Research Collaborative. And Dan, before we get into the particular findings of this new study, how does this research project build on the significant amount of research that you and Danielle and others have done previously?
Yeah, we've been working on this for about 7 years now. We've tried to collect information from a lot of the various stakeholders involved with donor advised funds. We've interviewed the donors themselves. We've collected financial transactions from over 111 donor advised fund programs all around the country. We've sent out donor surveys. We've surveyed the managers at these DAFs. But what this research really does is it tells the story of the professional fundraisers, and from their perspective, how are DAFs affecting their day-to-day job in raising money? I'll give you one example. We saw from this financial data that we collected that only about 3.7, a little less than 4% of all DAF transactions are completely anonymous, and that they don't have any donor information on them. But when we talk to fundraisers, that's a real issue, right? That DAF grants are coming through that they don't know who's sending them. And so we're trying to understand kind of what's going on there. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but it helps us to understand kind of everybody's perspective on what's happening with DAFs.
And I would just echo Jen's initial comment, Dan. When we teach for the fundraising school, we bring up DAFs. The course just takes over. The class just takes over. The participants just take over with so many questions. So, Jen, I'm going to ask you and Dan to both talk about various findings that the study has discovered. What stands out for you? What were some of the new discoveries from this latest research?
Well, one of the things that we were interested in exploring was how do fundraisers think about their interactions with DAF donors? And, we ultimately concluded that the relationship fundraising paradigm still holds. It's about relationships, but some of the challenges came up when fundraisers had challenges in figuring out who a DAF donor was, and then had issues forming a. This was a key concern of the fundraisers. As Dan was saying, very few DAF grants are fully anonymous, but every one of those is a concern for the fundraisers, right? They just hate not being able to say thank you to those donors. We appreciate you. Here's what your gift is doing. And so anything that they could do to, figure out who those donors might be, because sometimes they weren't really meant to be anonymous, right? Sometimes it was a paperwork mix up or a data processing mix up or a donor that the donor thought they would know it was them giving from the DAF, and they didn't. And so that was just one of the complications that affected things at kind of the front end of a DAF grant, and really shone a spotlight on the importance of data processing, gift administration, helping make sure that everybody has the resources, the tools, the experience they need to put in those DAF grants properly into the systems, to use the CRMs to identify donors in their permanent record as using DAFs. And so there were some challenges in that space. And then there were a lot of opportunities that centered on having deep conversations with donors about their philanthropic hopes and goals and how the DAF could help facilitate that. And then also some confidence that came from knowing a donor had a DAF, that told the fundraisers, hey, this person has philanthropic intent. They already have made a decision that this is philanthropic money. Number two, a lot of them had asked some assets to be able to put towards that. And then, thirdly, the fundraisers kind of felt more confident then at having these solicitation conversations when they knew that the resources were already there. And so those are some things that stood out to me, and of many. We're excited to share many more, and I know Dan will share some more now too.
Yeah, Dan, you've talked about anonymity that can come from a DAF grant, and Jen touched on that as well, and in endeavoring to build relationships, hopefully having that knowledge in advance. So if an anonymous grant comes, maybe you have an initial clue who it could come from. What else was illuminating? Again, you've done so much research on this topic. What were some of the aha findings for you?
Jen already kind of mentioned this, but when we really were digging into this kind of this misinformation or this miscatching of the information, what we realize is fundraisers, we really need to work with our gift entry teams and our data entry teams to make sure that when a grant comes in from a donor advised fund, even though it might have the name of an organization at the top, that check is really coming from a donor, and we need to get better about assigning soft credit to the donor who is kind of behind that gift, and then hard crediting the account that's at that organization. And so there's a little bit of a process change that we're getting used to. Some of the fundraisers we talked to, they had really figured it out, right? They had made adjustments in their CRM, they had made adjustments to their process. Some fundraisers were still having a hard time with this, where gifts would come in, they never knew that the donor had sent it, and really when they dug into it, it was the information was there, but it just didn't get into the system correctly, so that they couldn't continue that relationship management. So that's one of the big pieces coming out of this research is let's make sure that we're training our staff correctly, that everyone understands how to process these grants in a way that can help us maintain those relationships with donors.
Dan, I wonder if this came up in the study as you and Jen were surveying fundraisers themselves. I know when I teach, invariably somebody will raise their hand and say, wait a minute, these donor advised funds, these are bad. People are using them as a parking lot. They get the tax write-off, and that's all that's going on here. And I don't know if that came up in the study, if fundraisers were telling you that. And even if it did not, what advice do you have? Because I know I can tell you anecdotally as we teach, we hear it all the time. How can fundraisers lead up to their chief development officer, their CEO, their board, people out in the community when they're hearing some of these very well-intended concerns that some folks might have about donor advised funds?
Sure. We asked fundraisers, what do you think? I mean, do you think these are good? Are they bad? Are they helping? Are they hurting? And for the most part, fundraisers generally recognize that donor advised funds are good for the donors themselves. And so having kind of this donor-centric mentality, if this is a good thing for the donors I'm working with, it's generally a good thing. Now, obviously, they were recognizing some of the challenges on the back end, but some of the places where we saw fundraisers who had kind of figured things out and how to work with DAF donors were telling us, couple things. One is they could qualify donors in a way that just knowing that they had a DAF, it signaled that they had intent, they had capacity, they could move them right to the major gift prospect list. Just knowing, even if it was only $100 or $500 gift coming in, if it came from a DAF, all of a sudden they said, I'm going to treat this donor a little bit differently. I'm going to prospect them differently. Then once they got in touch with the donors, they could have deeper conversations and say, tell me about setting up a DAF. Oh yeah, well, I sold my business or I did that. And all of a sudden you're having conversations about wealth. You're having conversations about what they want to do with their philanthropy. And so we noticed that fundraisers who kind of understood how to connect with DAF donors were having really meaningful, deep conversations that then led to really significant grants and donations to their organizations.
Especially since we know from your previous research at our school that somebody who holds a DAF, generally those folks are our most strategic donors. As Jen, you indicated, folks have put this money away by and large for philanthropic intent. Do we have some folks just using it as a tax shelter? Of course, that's human nature, and we do have some of that. But some of the other data, Jen, that I've always been impressed by, and this comes from Dan and his colleagues, is that DAFs hold about 1/5 of the amount of money that private foundations do, and yet grant out about half as much as private foundations do every year. A much higher proportion comes out of DAFs every single year to this point about these folks being strategic donors. And I want to remind our audience, Jen's research has also included studying the fundraising profession and what fundraisers need, both in terms of their hard skills and their intangibles. And Jen, as you worked on this study, what advice do you have for fundraisers, the findings from this study and what you also know about the fundraising profession overall?
Well, Bill, thanks for asking me that question, because in this study, we also included a part on the roles that fundraisers play when they're working with DAF donors. And so we looked through our interviews and our conversations with the almost 50 fundraisers from across the country. And we decided that we saw some themes around roles that they were playing. And so some of those roles were things like educator. So, how are they coaching, guiding, helping their donors understand the ins and outs of DAFs? Now, some DAF donors really savvy. They're helping the fundraisers understand, right? That happens too. But in other cases, donors needed a little help in kind of moving through the process and understanding how to navigate the nuances of their DAFs. Fundraisers also were facilitators. So they were helping, like Dan was saying, sometimes there were bumps in the road, how things got processed or, knowing which organization was yours in the DAF sponsor platform. And so fundraisers helped with that kind of thing. They also helped in terms of regulations, right? And thinking about what does my donor need to know so that there aren't problems later for them or for the organization. And so those are a few of the things that we discovered. There's some other roles as well. But this really fits into my other work studying fundraisers and thinking about how, and our teaching on fundraising too, right, Bill, about being adaptable, being versatile, being self-aware in these circumstances and being strategic and kind of adapting to what is needed from a particular donor, in this case, those using a DAF. Of course, fundraisers are adapting to all of their donors, but we really identified some things that were specific to when they interacted with people who had DAFs.
And Dan, we always direct folks to the Donor Advised Fund Research Collaborative website. What is this particular study that people should look for on your website? And what other advice do you have for fundraisers as they learn from these findings and apply this to their work?
So one of the things that Jen really helped us do is revise kind of a new donor relationship management cycle. And so one of the things that we do is we take kind of the 8-step, major gift cycle, and we kind of revise it, and we show, okay, here in these steps, make sure to do this with your DAF donor and this step. And we add a few things. And so what they can look for is kind of a new relationship management cycle that is really customized if you're working with a DAF donor. A couple other things that are really important is make sure you're having really open conversations with all of your donors about donor advised funds, right? One of the ways that folks figure out that someone has a DAF is just saying, okay, you're in the solicitation phase and you're saying, okay, how is this gift going to come in? Are you using a donor advised fund to make your gifts, right? So kind of proactively asking if they have a DAF, and if they do, making sure you're getting all the right information, right? Okay, what organization are you using? What is the name of the account at that organization? So just making sure you're kind of collecting all the right information. But again, I'd go back to something Jen said earlier on. This is still all about relationships, right? There's a few little more administrative tasks here and there with donor advised funds, but I think the benefits outweigh the challenges that you can really have deep conversations with folks about their philanthropy, knowing that they've set aside a significant amount of money to give to charity. And so we hope that as folks learn the ropes, that they'll also be able to have much more meaningful relationships.
And Dan, I love that adaptation to the major gift fundraising cycle. Previous research by you and Danielle and Jen and others has shown that giving out of DAFs is very similar to what we see typically in annual fund and major gift fundraising, that the smaller gifts often are unrestricted. The smaller grants, just like an annual fund, the larger grants usually are restricted, just like in major gift fundraising. And so to lay this up as we reimagine the cycle of donor advised fund relationship building, that's the study that you need to look for, and brought to us by two of our colleagues who have top expertise in this. Dan, always a delight to see you. Thanks for being back with us on the podcast.
Bill. Thanks, Bill.
And Jen, I know our audience will see you soon again in the classroom, but thanks for being with us on the podcast.
Thank you so much. And let me just say one more thing. Thank you to all of our participants, many of whom came to us by way of hearing about the project through the fundraising school. And so we're just really grateful to all of you and to the fundraising school for your support of this project and important research that others are doing in the field too.
Such a fundraiser. Always remembering to say thank you and expressing that gratitude. Thanks for modeling that for us, Genevieve. So at the fundraising school, we have information about donor advised funds in so many of our courses, 25 in all, that lead to 5 different certificates now, in person, online, in the United States, anywhere across the world. We can also customize our training for you just on DAFs, if that's what you're interested in, or a little bit of this course, a little bit of that course, knit it all together, tailor-made just for you. And we can do that in person or online. We have our quarterly webinars, our weekly podcasts, and of course, our textbook, our lead co-editor, Dr. Jen Shaker. And all of the information is available online at go.iu.edu/TFRS for the fundraising school. I'm grateful for our producers, Jennifer Boffman, CFRM, as well as our Emmy Award winner, Mike Anthony. I'm Bill Stanczykiewicz, and now you are now more fully informed on this first day from the fundraising school.